It was 1982, and I was 24 years old, living in a transient hotel in the Tenderloin of San Francisco. That room was pretty much like every other hotel room I lived in New York or Chicago or anywhere else. And I woke up that morning thinking my day would be pretty much like every other day I'd lived. Only that morning when I woke up and sat up in bed and looked around that room, there was this strange alien thought I had that I didn't want to be there, and maybe I even deserve something more. But as soon as I had that thought, it was like there was a cacophony of voices in my head telling me that I didn't deserve anything more, and that was ridiculous. It was the voice of the nun in the all-white Catholic school telling me that I'd never be as smart as the other kids because my dad was Native. It was the voice of my mom saying that I was an abomination when I came out to her. It was the things that people said to us kids who were on the street. It was the voice of a 29-year-old who dated me when I was 17 and told me I better do what he said and earn him some money because I owed him for putting up with me. Usually those were the voices that stopped me in my tracks anytime I thought my life could be different. But for some reason that morning, like an out-of-body experience, I watched my hands pulling clothes out of the dresser and off the floor and shoving them into a duffel bag. I watched my feet walking across the old green carpet in the hotel hallway, down the elevator to the front desk, where I wordlessly dropped the key to my room onto the desk in front of the desk man and walked out. I had a small piece of paper with the number of a woman I met that told me if I ever wanted to go to treatment, she'd help me get there. And that's where I went. In the first 2 years of my new life, I was pretty much expecting to fail at any moment, but strangely, that kept not happening. I passed my GED. I got a job at a garment factory. I sewed the left cuff onto blue dress shirts. My boss there thought I was good enough that he encouraged me to try to get into fashion design school, and I was set to start in the fall. In the midst of all of that, somehow I had acquired a partner. It started with Scarlett asking me out on a date. He suggested we go get burritos in the Mission. That was his idea for the date. But my idea was that pretty much the date would end in him completely rejecting me once he knew me. So during the first 5 minutes of our dinner, I stared at a carnitas burrito and blurted out all the gory details of my past and working Polk Street. And when I finished, he stood up, but not to walk out of the restaurant like it went in my script. But instead, he came around my side of the table, took my hand, stood me up, hugged me, and said, "You're safe now." From there, somehow he morphed from one date to a boyfriend to a partner, and I moved in with him. He was Native too and lived with his extended family, his brother, his auntie, and uncle who were in their 70s. And his whole family was just as encouraging and supportive to me as he was, which I think most people would be like, hey, my life's kind of ideal right now. I'm happy. But my reaction was, my life's kind of ideal right now. I'm terrified. I had this idea that somehow one morning, everybody around me, my boss, my teacher, my boyfriend, his family, would wake up and somehow see the real me, and I didn't know who the real me was, but I knew it wasn't good. And this anxiety built and built until I began to have panic attacks, and everybody around me was understanding of that, which was even more uncomfortable. One night, I got home from my shift at the garment factory. It was about midnight, and Scarlett's uncle found me sitting in the kitchen, snapping a rubber band against my wrist because somebody had told me that would cure anxiety. He asked, "How's the rubber band thing working out?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe I need a different kind of rubber band because so far Not much. He sat down with me and he said, "You know, I used to have that anxiety," which surprised me because he was like the calmest man I'd ever met. And then he said a single phrase: "When I was young, they took me away to boarding school." That phrase was short, but to me, as another Native person, it told a long story of a time when our government had the motto of "kill the Indian to save the man," and children were forcibly removed to the boarding schools where physical and sexual violence was rampant. And suddenly I realized, this scene with my uncle, this man that I never thought much about what his past was a survivor like me. He said that that weekend he was going outside the city, that they were having a NEPI, a sweat lodge. He said, "Maybe you should come with us, and maybe it will be a little bit better than that rubber band." And so that Saturday morning, we all got in the car and we drove. I was debating whether or not I should mention to anyone in the car that I'd never been to a sweat lodge before, but that was embarrassing, to be a Native person and be so disenfranchised from my own culture that I didn't even know what was really going to happen. I figured I'll wing it. When we got there were 5 or 6 people sitting around a fire where the stones were being heated for the lodge. I was introduced to them all, but I had so much anxiety that their names, everything else being said, sounded like Charlie Brown's parents in those old cartoons. After we all sat down, Scarlett took a packet of bugler tobacco out of his pocket and handed it to me and said, "Go give this to the medicine man. Tell him what kind of help you need." And I was terrified, because Scarlett told me stories about how medicine people were so in touch with everything in this world and the spirit world that sometimes they knew things about people that they'd never been told. And I felt like if I got near that medicine man, he'd see me. And when he saw me, maybe this was a moment that if nobody else realized that something was wrong with me, he'd announce it to them and all the good things in my life would be over. I walked over to him and wordlessly held out the tobacco. I knew that our way of offering this tobacco was to offer it 4 times. And if that man was willing to help me, he'd accept it on the 4th time. And so I moved it towards his hands 3 times. On the 4th time, he took it from me. And as he did, I looked at his forearms and saw the kind of tattoos that you have in prison. And suddenly, I stopped seeing him as a frightening entity and saw him as a man that had his own story, maybe like mine. He motioned for me to sit down next to him, and without embarrassing me by asking if I'd ever been to a sweat lodge, he sat there and told me what was going to happen. Then he stood up and said, "Let's go in." We all filed into the small sweat lodge. It was willow branches covered with old blankets and a canvas. The willow branches formed the shape of a star in the roof. The rocks were brought in, a bucket of water. He said, "Are we ready to start?" People nodded and murmured yes. But before he closed the door, he said, "Nephew." It took me a minute to realize he was addressing me. He was using a kinship term for me, the way that we do, to remind us of our relationship to all the people in this world, and even to all the things in this world. He said, "Nephew, your ancestors knew you before you were born. They've seen every single part of your life. They saw your beauty when you didn't see it, and they're glad you're home. And nephew, I see you, we see you, and we're glad you're home." With that, the door closed. The water splashed against the hot rocks. A steam rose up, and it felt like I was taking the first breath of my life. 20 years later, I was standing in the chaos that happens when you work for a nonprofit that's low on budget and decides that, yes, you alone can teach a powwow dance class to 60 kids age 4 to 24 and it'll be fine. I was trying to scan the room, making sure that Marcus didn't try to let his plastic dinosaur toys swim in the soup again this week, looking over here to make sure that Beth wasn't jumping off the stage. In the middle of it, I heard, "Mr. Alistair, Mr. Alistair." And I turned around to see a young girl with a new shawl that her grandmother had made her. And she said, "Don't I look beautiful?" And I said, "Yes." And she danced by and we high-fived. I was technically there to teach the children to dance, but I also knew that they were learning to love themselves enough. If any voice ever came to tell them they were less than, there wouldn't be room in their hearts to hear it. Thank you.